I'm Chris Oppie. I'm a professor of history here and director of the Ellsberg Initiative for Peace and Democracy. It's my honor to welcome you to the third annual Ellsberg Lecture by acclaimed environmental and climate justice activist, writer, and educator, also educated, Bill McKibben. This lecture is being hosted on the campus of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which was founded and built on the unceded homelands of the Pecumtuck Nation on the land of the Norwadtug community. We also acknowledge that UMass Amherst is a land-grant university. As part of the Morrill Land Grant Act, portions of land from 82 native nations west of the Mississippi were sold to provide the resources to found and build this university. I want to begin with a few words about Daniel Ellsberg, who was the inspiration for our work. In 2019, the Robert S. Cox Special Collections and University Archives at UMass acquired the papers of Ellsberg, this extraordinary treasure trove of more than 600 boxes of material. Many of you know that in 1971, Ellsberg, our nation's most famous whistleblower, faced a possible 115-year prison sentence for releasing to the press and public a 7,000-page secret history of the Vietnam War, the so-called Pentagon Papers, exposing decades of government lies and deceit about the causes and conduct of that war. What is less well known is that Ellsberg devoted the rest of his long life, more than 50 years, until his death last year, to nonviolent activism in pursuit of nuclear disarmament, a more democratic and anti-imperial foreign policy, and environmental justice. In his papers, you can see his growing interest in climate change starting in the early 1990s, and he was certainly familiar with and admiring of the work of tonight's speaker. Our goal is to create a permanent Ellsberg Institute for Peace and Democracy at UMass. The mission is to promote public understanding, scholarship, and activism in support of compelling, democratic, and sustainable alternatives to militarism, authoritarianism, and environmental degradation. If you want to help that effort with a contribution tonight, please see Brennan Tierney in the back. He's waving at us. I also want to take the opportunity to thank Brennan for all the hard work he's done putting the fall programs together with help from two great student interns, Emily Looney and Melissa Daddario, who I think are here. Yeah. A brief word about an exciting upcoming program. During the week of February 24th, we will host the second annual Ellsberg Activist in Residence, and that will be Varshini Prakash. Varshini graduated from UMass in 2015, and in 2017 co-founded the Sunrise Movement, a youth-led climate justice organization, which she was the executive director of from 2018 to 2023. Members of Sunrise Amherst are here tonight, and they have a table in the back. They'd be delighted to talk with any of you that might want to learn more about their work and get involved. Amherst Bookstore also kindly has set up a table to sell some of Bill's many books, not all of them, but a few. So thanks to Nat Harold for being here to do that. That's in the back. Yeah. I want also to thank co-sponsors of this event, the departments of history, English, sociology, political science, anthropology, comparative literature, and social thought and political economy, along with the Political Economy Research Institute and the Schools of Public Policy and Earth and Sustainability. After the lecture, we will have time for questions. So I would ask you if you're interested in giving a question, to line up over on that side of the room, and Brennan will be there with a handheld microphone, and we take turns asking questions. Malcolm Sen over here will serve as moderator for good reason. He's got some real special expertise in this field. He's a professor in the English department at UMass and has for many years worked on the relationship between literature, politics, statehood, and the environment, including climate change. He leads the Environmental Humanities Initiative here at UMass with the goal of creating a center for the environmental humanities. He's also co-chair of our campus's Sustainability Strategy Working Group. And now I have the honor to introduce Bill McKibben, one of the world's foremost climate activists and educators. In 2008, McKibben founded 350.org, the first global grassroots campaign to fight climate change. More recently, he founded Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60, like me, to work on climate and racial justice. He is a contributing writer for The New Yorker and has written more than a dozen books about the environment, including most recently, and you can purchase it in the back, a book called The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. It's a great title. Along with his very first book in 1989, path-breaking work called The End of Nature. If I could just call out a personal favorite that really doesn't have anything to do with the environment, but it's about television. It's called The Age of Missing Information, written in the mid-90s, I think, but it couldn't be, it's more relevant now than ever. McKibben also teaches at Middlebury College, where he's the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence. He's received many major prizes, including the Gandhi Peace Prize and the Right Livelihood Prize, which is sometimes referred to as the Swedish Nobel Prize. He has received honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities, including, I'm proud to say, University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So I give you Dr. Bill McKibben.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and what a pleasure to be here in this absolutely beautiful building. Now, you know, I am a unrepentant New Englander, and I'm well aware that UMass Amherst is the kind of educational center of our region in an awful lot of ways. And I've been here many times, and even when I was in high school, I'd come here in the summer for things. And I gotta say, as much as I admired and enjoyed it, the architecture of this campus leaves me slightly cold some of the time. There's a brutalist quality to it, and it is such a pleasure to be in this building for the first time and have a different memory of UMass, a sort of physical memory to take home. It's very good to be here. And it's very good to be here in a way in December of 2024, after a miserable month. This is first talk I've given in the last few weeks. I was on the road constantly, without stop, all summer and fall, out just day after day in all the swing states doing what we could. And at Third Act, we managed to do a lot to mobilize people, but obviously not enough. And so now we're in a different place, in a different phase, and we have to figure out what to do with it. And that's really what I'm going to try and talk with you about tonight for a little while. 2024 drags to a close with a number of sad achievements. This is going to be, when the record keeping is done, the hottest year that we've ever recorded on this planet. Our records only go back a few hundred years, but the scientists are good at developing proxy records glacial cores and ocean sediments that let us take that record much further back, and they're completely convinced that 2024 was the hottest year in the last at least 125,000 years on this planet. And we've just come through a basically failed set of global climate talks in Azerbaijan that accomplished almost nothing, maybe less than nothing in certain ways. They began auspiciously when the president of Azerbaijan welcomed everybody to the conference by explaining that fossil fuel was a gift from God. So, and they went downhill from there. And of course, we've had the election, re-election of Donald Trump to the presidency of the United States. Regardless of the fact that he, and perhaps because of the fact that he kept resolutely proclaiming that climate change was a hoax, a difficult position to hold in 2024, but one that he resolutely continues to insist upon. And insist upon in, it must be said, the most witless possible ways. He kept in this past campaign insisting that even if climate change were real, it would be fine because it would be increasing the amount of oceanfront property, as he said at one talk after another. Which, if you think about it, is insane on its own terms. Anybody who's lain in the bathtub with the tap running and watched as their navel slowly disappeared beneath the rising water should be able to understand that a rising sea decreases the amount of oceanfront property, not increases it. But there we are. The fossil fuel industry has achieved in its own mind all of its aims. They worked harder than they've ever worked this year. They mobilized every bit of money that they could, and they're firmly convinced that they are in the catbird seat and in control of the situation now in a way that they haven't been for a while. And I do not want to minimize any of that in any way. In fact, in line with my lifelong career as a professional bummer-outer of other people, I'm going to dwell on it for a moment and try and drive home exactly where we are, because we're in a very, very difficult place. You remember that in Paris in 2015, the world's nations pledged that we would do everything that we could not to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in the global average temperature. Well, we've now exceeded it. The global average temperature this year will be more than 1.5 degrees Celsius higher. And it's coming with all kinds of scary indications that not only are we seeing the sort of steady increase in temperature and disruption, but that we're seeing or edging very close to some of the most remarkable possible tipping points in our physical systems. As you know, we've been having fires in the Amazon for several decades now as people try to deforest around the edges of the Amazon in order to grow soybeans or raise cattle or whatever it is. But the last 18 months, we've seen a really deep drought in the center of the Amazon, and we're now finding forest fires in the middle of the rainforest, far from where there are human beings, because that record drought is breaking down the kind of exquisite mechanism by which the rainforest serves to transport water in from the oceans in 4 or 5 or 6 stages. In the Atlantic, we think that we're now observing the flickering and the faltering of the great currents, the Atlantic meridional overturning current, of which the Gulf Stream is a kind of part, that is the biggest transport of heat from the southern latitudes up to the north, it's faltering because we think there's so much fresh water melting out of Greenland and out of the sea ice in the Arctic that it's changing the densities of seawater and reducing the force that drives that great conveyor belt that brings that warmth north. If that flickers or falters, and the estimate now is that it could happen anytime in the next couple of decades. There's a lot of new research in the course of this year on this phenomenon and a lot of new and scary measurement. That would be civilization challenging. The temperature of London would be, comparable to what we see in parts of Siberia now. People forget that, Milan in Italy is on a latitude line with Montreal. And just as the Europe cooled, so the parts of the tropics where that warmth comes from would see a dramatic increase, rapid increase in temperature, and along the line between them, we'd almost certainly see storms of a scale that we can only sort of begin to imagine now. The point I'm trying to make is that there are only so many huge physical features on our planet, and they're all now in some kind of chaotic flux. And when I say now, I mean really right now. I've been writing about climate change. I wrote the first book about it in the 1980s, so I've been following it as long as it was something you could really follow. And it's been a depressing and scary story as we've seen the steady ramp up in temperatures over the years. But right now, in the last 24 months or so, we've seen not a steady ramp up in temperature, but a pretty violent spike in that temperature. January 2023, so just about 2 years ago, oceanographer friends of mine started calling me and saying, you better start looking at what's happening with temperature in the ocean, sea surface temperature, because it's suddenly going off the charts. By spring of 2023, we were recording the highest temperatures we've ever recorded in the ocean. The buoys off the Florida coast were finding temperatures of 101 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what you set your hot tub at, And that heat quickly moved onto land by late June of 2023, we were recording, we take a daily average temperature around the planet. We have enough satellites and weather stations and buoys to be able to average them all and get a daily temperature every day. And when I say these are the hottest days in 125,000 years, those are the numbers we're going off of. They started to really spike right around the solstice in 2023. Those weeks around the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere are always the hottest days on our planet because most of the land mass is in the northern hemisphere and it traps heat like that. And it's just kept on since then, month after month after month after month. Even as El Nino waned and things, we've continued to have highly anomalous temperatures. 2024, as I say, is going to beat 2023 as the hottest year ever. That's all extremely scary. We're on a path now on our sort of current trajectory to raise the temperature of the planet in, by the time that the younger people in this room are my age, not 1.5 degrees Celsius, but something like 3 degrees Celsius, which is, 5-6 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, if it happens, probably incompatible with civilizations like the ones we're used to. The UN estimates that that's enough to put somewhere between 1 billion and 3 billion people on the move around the planet, have to leave their homes. The current estimate from all the studies is that each 1/10 of a degree Celsius we increase the temperature takes about 100 million people out of a climatically really habitable zone, okay? Think about a couple of billion people on the move because their home is underwater or too hot or too dry to allow them to stay there and grow food. Think about what 1 million or 2 refugees on our southern border did to fully warp and degrade the political life of our country, and much the same in Europe over the last decade or so, and then multiply that by 1,000 and try to imagine what kind of world we're living in. The most important job that humans have ever had is to try and keep that 1.5 degrees from becoming 3 degrees. Because if it does, the toll in human and other than human life will be incomprehensible. It will be, of course, the poorest and most vulnerable people who have done the least to cause it who are hit first. But truthfully, we're now moving past the point where we can really talk about the front lines and other. The front lines are increasingly absolutely everywhere now. We used to talk about places like Vermont, where I live, as a haven for the climate, and we've spent the last 3 years digging out from the worst floods that it's possible to imagine, unless you happened to be down in that climate haven, Asheville, North Carolina, earlier this year, where they had the kind of flooding you can only have in a globally warmed world, where the warm atmosphere can hold more water vapor. 48 inches of rain fell on the slopes of Mount Mitchell, north of Asheville, highest mountain in the east, in a day. I mean, that kind of water just roared down into all those creeks and hollows, and that was that for a lot of people in a lot of places. So we are in a very tough place, and there's no use trying to pretend otherwise. And that's the hard part. We're through the hard part now. I will take a breath, you take a breath, we will proceed. Because it's not all bad news. At exactly the same moment that this is happening, something else is happening too. The one thing that could potentially allow us to actually hold down somewhere below that 3 degrees and reorient the planet in some significant direction. And that's the absolutely ferocious and to some degree unexpected explosion of renewable energy over exactly the same period. And I do not think people, even people who are very concerned about this and think and keep track of it all the time, I'm not sure that even most of us are really quite aware of just what's happening and how fast and what the possibilities are. I told you that June of 2023 was when we first set these absolutely wild daily temperature records on this planet. The moment when the scientists were like just beginning to tear their hair out in the most frightened way. June 2023 was also the first month in which humans passed the point where we were putting up 1 gigawatt of solar panels every day. 1 gigawatt of solar panels is the rough equivalent of a nuclear power plant's worth every 24 hours. And that's continued to increase. We're now doing it about every 18 hours on this planet. Half of that's in China, who has been doing the bulk of the work here, but that still leaves a lot in the rest of the planet. In this country, I just saw the numbers this afternoon, something like 96% of the new generating capacity that's gone in America this year has been from the sun or the wind. And that's remarkable change from even a few years ago. And here's the thing. It's finally beginning, and fairly dramatically in the places where we've really done this work, to cut the use of fossil fuel, which is the point here. The point is not just to put up more renewable energy. If it's just adding on to what we're doing now, that doesn't help much. But at a certain point, it begins to do something else, which is really undercut the use of fossil fuel. California is the first place in this country that really tried hard to do this. And they've done a number of smart things around efficiency, around, at least until recently, around rooftop solar and around utility scale solar and wind and batteries. And it reached some critical mass this year. For almost every day since the 1st of March, including right into the end of November, California has produced more than 100% of the electricity that it uses for long stretches every day from renewable energy. At night, the biggest source of power on the grid in California has been the batteries that have been soaking up sunshine all afternoon. Those batteries didn't exist on that grid 3 years ago, okay? But now they're carrying the lion's share of the load in the evening. And the result is that California will use 25% less natural gas to generate electricity this year than it did last year. That's a big number. That's a big enough number to begin to take some bite out of that, if we can spread it everywhere, out of that 3 degrees Celsius. Remember, California is the 5th largest economy in the world. It's Germany in economic terms, okay? And it's not just California. Texas is now surpassing California in the rate at which it's building solar and wind and batteries. And that's good news. It's not just the rich world where this is happening. Even better news to me is what happened this year in Pakistan. Pakistan's probably been hit harder by climate change than any country on earth. They have some of the hottest and smoggiest cities on planet Earth. Week after week, where people have sweltered in temperatures in the 120 degree Fahrenheit range, just on and on and on. But their real problem has been flooding. Flooding on a scale we haven't seen since Noah. Twice in the last decade, there have been these truly epic floods. The last one 2 years ago covered something like a third of the country underwater and put 10, 15 million people out of their homes. People still not back in their homes, not recovered from that. I mean, people in much of Pakistan live in homes made from mud because it's a very good building material. It makes a lot of sense and it's economical until there's, 10 or 15 days of unrelenting rain and then your house just melts around you. And that's what was happening. And then after it, all the things you would expect, the outbreaks of cholera and on and on and on. So if there's any place that suffers from what's going on, it's Pakistan. But that's not really the motivation for what happened there this year. In the first part of the year, analysts were confused because demand for electricity on Pakistan's grid was dropping about 10%, which doesn't happen. It only happens in the case of real deep recession or something like COVID. Okay, the only things that cause demand for power to drop, and neither of those things was happening in Pakistan. And for a while, people couldn't figure out quite what was happening. But then, particularly with the help of Google Earth, people started looking at lots of pictures from Lahore and Islamabad and Karachi and wherever. And what they saw was solar panels going up on roof after roof after roof of stores, of small factories, of little malls, of people's houses, on and on and on. And what was happening was the supply of cheap solar panels from China, Pakistan's right nearby, so it was an easy place for them to kind of leak into, there was such an oversupply, and they were so cheap that people were just buying them and putting them up, not asking permission, not getting rebates, not anything else, just doing it. And by this point, by November, in the last year, Pakistanis have built on their own, in a year, the equivalent of roughly 50% of the existing national electric grid, just out of solar panels on roofs. Farmers in Pakistan depend on, probably many of you have traveled in parts of Asia, in Pakistan or India or Bangladesh, and seen these tube wells, the sort of deep wells that are the mainstay of irrigation, a kind of byproduct of the Green Revolution, and that usually rely on diesel engines to drive the pumps to bring the water up from down below. And you often hear that chug of the pump in the distance. And obviously the price of buying the diesel is a huge percentage of people's expenditure. Well, solar panels were so cheap that farmers are getting them, and they don't have the money usually to build the elaborate steel mounts to put them on, so they're just laying them on the ground and pointing them up, and they're working fine. Here's the thing. Pakistan this year is going to use 30% less diesel fuel than it used last year. Diesel's mostly used to drive those irrigation pumps. Those changes, and we can see the same thing starting to happen across much of Africa, those are very big. They're very good signs of what's possible. And possible because two things have happened over the years. One is that activists have demanded change and set up the conditions for the second thing, which is for engineers to drive down dramatically the price of this energy. So, for example, in the 1990s, when the German Greens held the balance of power in their parliament, they used that power to demand this system of what they called, I can't say the word in German, it's very long, but feed-in tariffs in general, just a way to get money back when you put power into the utility grid. And it was expensive because solar panels were expensive then, but the Germans, because of that activism, decided to pay the price. And with that market established, the Chinese in particular learned how to build solar panels really cheaply. Solar panels and wind turbines. The cost of power from those two things has dropped 90% in the last decade. And now the cost of batteries to store that power when the sun goes down or the wind drops is on just the same plummeting trajectory. And that means that sometime 3 or 4 or 5 years ago now, we crossed some invisible line where this became cheaper than using fossil fuel to produce energy. And that was an epochal moment in human history, really powerful. We haven't yet fully realized this. We've gotten so used to the kind of notion that fossil fuel is cheap and that clean energy would be an expensive sacrifice and so on, that it hasn't really sunk in. We still talk about this stuff as alternative energy, as if it was kind of the Whole Foods of energy, okay? But it's the Costco of energy. It's cheap and available in bulk off the shelf right now. And in places that are taking advantage of that, it's really, really starting to happen. Hopefully in time enough that we don't know, to to take some serious dent out of the climate damage, and definitely in time enough to take some serious dent out of the other thing that fossil fuel does, which is kill about 9 million people a year. It's 1 death in 5 on this planet that comes from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel, the particulates that are the result of setting things on fire. So this is a completely time-bound, absolutely newsworthy story about this particular moment and what we can do, but it's also, I think, a kind of timeless story. An amazing potential moment in human history. And I want to talk about that for a minute because I want you to be deeply excited about it, excited enough that you'll go to work to do what we need to do to make sure that it happens in time. Because time is the problem here. We have to do this fast if we're going to do it. The IPCC has told us that we need to cut emissions in half by 2030 to have some hope of sticking on anything like those Paris timetables. And 2030, by my watch, is 5 years and 3 weeks away. So, we've got our work 4 weeks away. We've got our work cut out for us. To do it, we need to be excited. And here's what excites me. I think we're at the moment where human beings are going to stop burning things. For 700,000 years, that's about as far back as the anthropologists can trace the first sort of campfire rings and things, humans have made their living by setting stuff on fire. Okay? Darwin said that language and fire were the 2 things that distinguished our species. And the fire was extraordinarily important. When we learned to cook food, that's what eventually produced the big brain, or so a lot of the anthropologists think. It allowed us to move north and south away from the equator. Nobody was living in the Pioneer Valley, pre-fire. I think even some of the anthropologists think that many millennia of standing around the campfire at night, staring into the embers, produced some of the social bonds, the tight social bonds that mark our species. It was a kind of proto-Zoom, for us to enjoy. And then, when we learned to control the combustion of coal and gas and oil in the 18th century, beginning in the 18th century, that produced modernity. That was the Industrial Revolution, and that gave us everything around us, everything that we understand as modern life. So combustion's been highly important, but now the cost is much, much too high. Existential in terms of climate, not existential risk, existential guarantee of some kind of large-scale destruction unless we get going soon. And much, much too high in terms of its cost in human health now. And happily, just at that moment, we no longer need it. Happily, we're at the moment when we can instead rely on the fact, since we're in church, I'll, rely on my sort of training as a Methodist Sunday school teacher, we can take advantage of the fact that the good Lord was kind enough to hang a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles up in the sky. And now we know how to make use of it. We can catch its rays on those photovoltaic panels. We can take advantage of the fact that it differentially heats the earth, producing the wind that turns those turbines. If you think about it, the other major form of renewable energy, hydropower, is solar power too, because that's what's evaporating that water and sending it up to the top of the mountain where it falls in rain and we can collected in dams. We don't think about that so much anymore because we've built out most of what we're going to build out with hydropower, and it's sun and wind where the action is. But we can rely on the sun to do what we need doing. That is a remarkable, remarkable moment. Maybe the most remarkable moment in thousands of years on this planet. Maybe since we figured out about agriculture. Maybe since we figured out about, coal and gas and oil a few hundred years ago. But one of those watershed moments, potentially. Now, does it come without cost? Is there no downside to it? Of course not. There's no free lunch in this world, and we have to take seriously what those costs are. For instance, we have to go mine stuff in order to make this happen. The clean technology that we're going to depend on, both to produce the electricity and then to use it, that holy trinity of appliances, the electric vehicle, or better yet, e-bike, the home heat pump, and the induction cooktop from your kitchen, they all depend on things like lithium and some cobalt and some copper and on and on and on. And we should, and are beginning to, I think, take steps to figure out how to mine that as responsibly as we can. But it will not be perfect because mining is a wound on the surface of the planet. However, and this is worth thinking about, it's going to be a much smaller wound than the one we're exacting right now. And if you think about it for even a moment, you'll quickly figure out why. You need some lithium to make your battery, say, to make this work. And you have to go mine that lithium or get it out of, hopefully, increasingly out of brine from places like the Salton Sea or places like that. But once you've got it, you put it in the battery, and then it does its job for the next 20 years in that battery, doing its thing. And now we know how to recycle those batteries, and increasingly we are doing it, and doing it really well. The first generation of batteries that come out of your car are not even recycled, they're just redeployed now in big ranks of batteries to provide utility scale storage, because they don't need to have, once they don't recharge quite as quickly to be as useful in a car, they still have all the use they need for the slower cycling that you need for utility battery backup. But when they get too old for that, we just, it's now fairly easy to recycle something like 97% of the lithium, of the cobalt, of the copper, of everything that we're using here. Rocky Mountain Institute put out a paper in September saying that essentially we should be able to do almost all the mining that we're going to need to do for the clean tech revolution by about 2050, after which point it should just be a kind of constant recirculation of the minerals that we've taken out of the ground. Contrast that with mining coal. What do you do when you have a lump of coal? You set it on fire, and then you have to go mine some more the next day, okay? That's what we do now. People ask sometimes if there's enough land to put renewable energy on. And they bitterly contest the idea that of using some of our land for producing energy. You know that out in this part of the world, there's been fights against putting windmills up on things. People don't want to look at them and so on, okay? It does take some land, okay? Because we're talking about an energy source, and I'll get to why I think this is basically a good thing, that's a little more diffuse than the very concentrated power that comes from coal and gas and oil. But it takes quite a bit of land, we think about the same amount actually, to produce fossil fuel, and you have to keep doing new parts of it each year because you've exhausted what was under the part you were doing before. Those of you who've traveled in the American West are well aware that there are large swaths of land where production of gas and oil or coal take up huge amounts of the landscape. And the best estimates from people like Mark Jacobson at Stanford are that the footprint would actually be somewhat smaller for renewable energy, much smaller than the footprint of land that we now use to grow corn to produce ethanol. And here I'm going to say something that may, since I've spent my life in rural America, and many of you have too, may, be slightly shocking. And we're used to thinking, if we look at a cornfield, that this is a good use of the landscape, that it's nature and agriculture and farming, okay? Half the corn in America is turned into ethanol, turned into gasoline now, okay? The land that's used to do it is, one way of thinking of a cornfield is that it's a solar collector of its own, just one that requires that you pour a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus on it to make it work, all of which washes downstream. That's why we have a huge dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, okay? And it's highly inefficient. Photosynthesis is a great trick, and thank heaven for it, but it's not very efficient, especially compared to something like a solar panel. Let me give you an example. I was in Illinois earlier this year with these guys I knew who were developing a lot of community solar farms out there. And we were standing next to one, and the guy I was with, wonderful guy, had one of those Ford F-150 Lightnings, the EV version of the most popular vehicle in America, the pickup, the Ford F-150 pickup. He said, here's an acre of land here in solar panels. Now, if this was growing ethanol, if this was growing corn to be used for ethanol, that acre would produce about enough ethanol to drive a Ford F-150 about 25,000 miles, okay? Which is not nothing. It's, it's something anyway. If you cover it in solar panels and produce electricity, it produces enough electricity to drive the Ford F-150 Lightning, not 25,000 miles, but 550,000 miles, okay? It's about 20 times more efficient than doing the process of photosynthesis to refining ethanol. That should be very, very good news, especially since we can do other things at the same time with a lot of that land. I wrote a piece for the New Yorker this summer with friends of mine up in Vermont who manage many solar fields for native pollinating plants in between the rows. And it's astonishing to be in there with these guys who can count all these wasps and bees and moths and things, and they're finding vast numbers of them just a few years after they've put these plantings in between the rows. It's beautiful. And I remember asking Mike Kernan, the guy that I was with, I said, well, see that cornfield over there? How many pollinators would you find, per minute over there? Because we just counted, I think it was 78 a minute that we were counting in this. That's how they count them, with a little clicker and a stopwatch. He said, well, if you went over there in that cornfield and counted them, the number would be essentially 0, because the whole thing is doused in spray all the time to make sure that there's nothing there but corn. The point I'm trying to make is this is an opportunity to rethink how we use the world in all kinds of ways, and we shouldn't let our immediate aesthetic sort of categories get in the way of reimagining how we use the world. There was a story yesterday in the paper about these trials from France, where they found that covering grape fields with solar panels was increasing the output of Chardonnay by about 60%. It was cutting the worst heat of the summer, and it wasn't getting as cold under the panels in the winter. So things were doing better. So I think that this is a remarkable moment. But I also think that it's only going to work, it's only going to happen if we push for it in the deepest ways. Because you know what? The fossil fuel industry has figured out what's going on. Why did they spend so much money electing Donald Trump? Because California is going to use 25% less natural gas this year than they did last year. That is a deep existential threat to big oil in every possible way. And so their reaction is to try and stamp it out in every way. Who do you think is funding an awful lot of the grassroots opposition to renewable energy development in place after place after place? Who do you think is pushing hard to have export of liquefied natural gas from America all over the world to hook as many other people as possible as fast as possible? It's going to take a real concerted effort to make this happen. An effort that's harder under the Trump administration probably, but perhaps not impossible. First thing I want to say is the rest of the world is going straight ahead with this, okay? And the rest of the world is actually larger than the US, it turns out. It's possible, in fact, that if the US succeeds in making itself fully irrelevant in this debate, which it may well, as we withdraw from the Paris talks and on and on and on, it's possible that that may make it easier, not harder, for the rest of the world to proceed. But even in this country, we're completely capable of continuing in lots of places to do this work. As I said, Texas is doing more than anybody else right now, okay? And that's a pretty good sign that it shouldn't be impossible even in Trump's America, because Texas is the absolute beating heart of the hydrocarbon industry, and even there the economics are just too compelling. But we need to push in order to make it happen fast enough to meet the demands of climate science. And so that's what I, at least, am going to be spending my next few years doing. We've done extraordinary work over the years to try and stop the fossil fuel industry as much as we could, to stand up to pipelines, to demand divestment, on and on and on. Those things will be hard for the next 4 years. And those things, in a way, were things we did because it was all we could do. Because when we were doing them, solar power and wind power were still too expensive to supplant fossil energy, and we had to figure out how to make as much progress as we could. But now we have the economic wind at our backs. Economic gravity is working in the right direction, and we just have to speed it along. We're going to try and do, we haven't yet announced it, and I guess I shouldn't tell you all this, but I can't help myself, because I want you to circle your calendar for the fall equinox next year, September about 21st, because we're going to try and do a big day of action that we're going to call Sun Day. It's going to be, we hope, a little like the first Earth Day back in 1970. Beautiful, full of art and music, but also full of some anger and passion and so on. There'll be lots of places where people are inaugurating new solar farms and having parades of e-bikes and on and on and on. Here in Massachusetts, where you've just passed a new climate law, a really good one with great help from 350 Massachusetts and Third Act Massachusetts and so many other activists, it'll be just the moment to be pushing hard here on this campus. It'll be an awfully good chance to remind everybody that I believe that UMass is on record as promising to be zero carbon by 2032. there's a lot of banners about it, but I'm not convinced that there's been yet quite the necessary progress to make it quite happen. So what a good moment to be doing that. Imagine all over the world people pushing this same message. And imagine, just for a minute, the way that it allows us to start reconnecting with the natural world in a powerful way. One of the things that happened with the Industrial Revolution was a kind of abstraction of human beings from the natural flow of things, because we were suddenly relying on these deep stocks of buried energy, not on the flows of energy that hit our planet all the time. And one result of that is that we really started taking very little notice of, say, the sun around us. If you think about it, it's quite remarkable how little time we spend thinking about this thing that gives us light and heat and photosynthesis, and now is happy to provide all the power that we need. We notice it now only when it does something weird, when there's an aurora and everybody's happy about that, or when, I don't know, did you guys get the totality of eclipse down here? We got it in Vermont, and it was amazing. I was on campus at Middlebury, and everybody was out, and what do you know, everybody put their phones down for like 5 minutes and watched this thing, and it was astonishing, you know. Wasn't that long ago when pretty much everybody in this world was a kind of sun worshiper of some kind or another, because it was the obvious ordering principle of daily life on our planet. I told you before that I'm a good Methodist, and I'm not proposing that we return to idolatry, for heaven's sake, or a kind of pagan anything, but I do note that the very first thing that happens in the book of Genesis is that God manages to put some light here on this planet and create the sun that illuminates the world around us. And I do think that it is a spectacular notion to imagine powering this world on energy from heaven, not from hell. And I think we can do it. I think we're going to have to push hard for it, but I think it's way worth pushing for. So, tough moment at the end of 2024, but not a moment entirely to despair. We have things now to go work for, and we will work for them hard. I will end just by saying, taking note of the demography of this room, that I think it's particularly important and beautiful for people of a certain age to be at work on this. Young people have done an amazing amount of the work that's been necessary in the climate fight. And I am so glad to hear that Varshini Prakash is coming back to UMass to be your activist in residence. If you don't know her, take advantage of that time to get to know her. She's one of my favorite colleagues in the whole world. And I remember when at age 17, she was leading civil disobedience here on campus to demand successfully divestment from fossil fuel. A great soul and representative of all the other young people who've done such amazing work. But you know what? It's not fair to demand that young people solve the biggest problem the world ever faced. And it's not smart either, because for all their energy and intelligence and idealism, by themselves they lack the structural power necessary to make change on the scale we need in the time that we have. They need the backup of those of us who do have. If you've reached the age when you have hair coming out your ears, then you have structural power coming out your ears as well, okay? And we need to use it, and we can, to make this change happen. That's why we set up Third Act a couple of years ago, and now we've got 100,000 members around the country who are working really, really hard, many of them in this room, to make things happen. And I am so grateful for all of that. And I'm so grateful for all of you. Cannot guarantee you the outcome of these fights. We don't know. But I can guarantee you that you have millions upon millions of brothers and sisters around the world. And I can guarantee you that we'll carry on this fight, and we will carry it on in the right spirit, with the firm conviction that it is possible to take this beautiful world and make it not only work, but work far more beautifully than it's working right now. Thank you all very much.
Great to see you again.
So good to see you.
Thank you, everybody. So I'm going to give you some time now to come up with questions. I might just have a question or two for Bill McKibben, and while I do so, feel free to jot down any questions that you might have. Thank you, Bill. That was fantastic and kind of great to have you back here at UMass again. As you were speaking, I was thinking about Dickens's Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But 2024 seems to be the most strangest of times, the most absurd of times. And I say this especially because I just came back from India yesterday, from Delhi, a city that my sister described as a gas chamber.
And it's in a particular, there's been just the last couple of weeks have been terrible in Delhi.
I can say that my body is still in shock. It's really a lack of oxygen at a cellular level. And I also noticed, a transformation of the vocabulary of children. AQI has become common parlance. It's air quality index, right? And my nephew and niece, 9 and 5 years old, and they check the AQI before they go out of their apartment. So kind of thinking about all of those, and also hearing your message about the obligation to endure, the obligation to be positive, to fight. I'm also thinking, though, isn't it the case that part of the problem of the merchants of doubt about climate change has been their very canny ability to disconnect the crises, so that the environmental crisis appears as a singular thing, the refugee crisis appears as a distinct thing. And yet these are all nested phenomena. Because we are at the Ellsberg Institute, I'm thinking, yes, consumerist behavior is changing, and that's fantastic. But I wonder if you might say a few words about the military bootprint, which far exceeds the consumerist carbon footprint, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So the thing about carbon that's so amazing is the degree to which it comes from everywhere. So the US military is the single biggest producer of carbon dioxide in the world. But it's about 1% of all the carbon dioxide in the world. So it's a reminder of that. I mean, that's why this thing is so hard to solve, because on every afternoon around every city and the entire world, there's this rush hour of cars with red taillights, lighting up the afternoon, evening gloom, and they're all producing, until very recently, when a few of them were EVs, they're all producing huge amounts of CO2. To me, the military, the thing that's the biggest, deepest connection to militarism here is what it is that we use our military for. And I think it's fair to say that the geopolitics of the world in the post-World War II era would have looked very, very different if we'd been running the world for those 75 years on the sun instead of on hydrocarbons. One of the problems with hydrocarbons is that they're only available in a few places. Okay, there aren't any in Massachusetts, say. It means that the people who end up controlling those geographically concentrated supplies have way more power than they should, and they almost invariably use it badly. In our country, for instance, the biggest hydrocarbon barons, the guys who controlled the most refining and pipeline capacity, were the Koch brothers. And they used their winnings to destroy our democracy. If you want to know why we have Donald Trump now, the single biggest reason is what the Koch brothers and their network spent the last 4 decades very diligently pursuing. In Europe, the biggest hydrocarbon baron is Vladimir Putin. And he used his winnings to launch a land war in Europe in the 21st century, you know. One of the most beautiful things about the world, about power from the sun and the wind, is that it's everywhere. Everybody has some. And in fact, maybe the most beautiful thing about it is that there's more of it towards the equator, that it has a kind of natural rebalancing of some of the world's power structures if we're able to move in that direction. Now, to make that happen, we need some serious financing from the global north. There's an excess of capital in the global north. You can tell there's an excess because we spend it chasing completely ridiculous stuff, cryptocurrency, chat GPT, whatever it is. Figuring out how to deploy that capital to allow the energy transition in the developing world is incredibly important, and it's especially important because once it happens, once we build those solar panels and wind turbines and batteries in those places, then they're free of the need to be buying fossil fuel from the north, which is the reason, more than anything else by far, that all these countries are in balance of payment deficits and on and on and on, because they're shipping money out to Saudi Arabia and Texas and wherever else in order to run their economies when, in fact, they've got everything they need right at hand. So I think that the possibility for a very different geopolitical order is graspable here, and I don't think there's anything that we could do that would accelerate that more quickly than the move to renewable energy, which we have to do in order to keep ourselves alive anyway. So this is a subversive moment in interesting ways, I think.
Thank you. I just want to make sure that we have time for your questions. I have lots myself, but if you want to go ahead, maybe.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, Bill. I'm Angel. It's nice to meet you. I wanted to know, so addressing the climate crisis, is it going to require a transformational change in our economy and in our way of life? And so I'd like to know where you believe, what cultural changes do you think are necessary, and where do you see these cultural changes starting today?
So, this is a super interesting question and one that I'm thinking a lot about right now. I've written a lot over the years about the ways that the kind of consumer world that we inhabit drives a lot of the environmental problems that we face. And that's true, but it becomes less true as we move towards renewable energy. That is, you can imagine doing many of the things that I have a house covered with solar panels, and it supplies all the energy that I have a refrigerator filled with cold beer, and I, take a hot shower more days than not, and, on and on and on. I do think that humans will decide over time that high consumer capitalism is not the way that they want to live. I've written a lot. I wrote a book called Deep Economy. That's sort of my, longest on this. The biggest flaw in the sort of economic growth model is that it doesn't make humans as happy as it claims to. Maybe the opposite. And I think over time we will figure out different ways to be on this planet. But I do not think that we're going to do that in any big way over the next 5 years. I do not think that that is a serious way to deal with the very time-limited climate crisis that we face. I think the only thing that we can do at scale that matters is the substitution of clean energy for dirty energy that I've been discussing. And you know what really drove that home for me? And part of what drove it home for me is the difficulty of getting anyone to change anything, okay? I started campaigning against SUVs 25 years ago. It was the first, and I gotta say, we did a good job, man. We had, got lots of attention and but man, what a failure. Everybody just keeps driving bigger, and it's those of us of a certain age, it's hard for younger people to believe that there was a time when we didn't just each require a semi-military vehicle in order to, get our stuff around. And then when COVID hit, people changed their lives more than any environmentalist could ever imagine. Nobody went anywhere for months, and it did drive emissions down, but not very much, like 10% at the max, okay? Which to me was the really profound indication that this isn't a question of kind of individual choices as much as it is the technical guts of the system, which run on coal and gas and oil and have to be ripped out and replaced with sun and wind and batteries. That said, I think we can do all this in ways that help with that long-term project of changing the ways in which we live in good ways. And I'll tell you, here's an example of something that I think we should be doing. We give a big rebate right at the moment until Trump, and for his own commercial purposes, Elon Musk, try to take it away. We give a $7,500 rebate for EVs, which I think is very wise. But the thing that got stripped out of the Inflation Reduction Act that I thought was at least as wise was like a $1,500 rebate for e-bikes. That's the truly transformative technology on this planet, and it's saving much more carbon already than EVs are. You go and I think even now in Delhi, people are quickly converting the auto rickshaws into batteries work great for this purpose because you can change them out easily in and out. E-bikes are amazing. They're an entirely new thing. They're a bicycle that without hills. That's what they are, and that's a very different machine than what you had before, and they use almost no power at all. It's like, I think I just saw that it was like, it's under a penny a mile to produce the power that required for an e-bike. So those are examples, and you're beginning to see places that are taking advantage of all this. Paris has transformed itself in the last 4 or 5 years. It's now a city increasingly without cars. And it hasn't changed that much the kind of overall profile of France, but it's beginning to, and those are the kind of things that can happen. So look for those possibilities, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. the basic job is to build a lot of solar panels and wind turbines and batteries very fast, I think.
Thank you.
Hello, Dr. McKibben. Daniel, nice to meet you. So you mentioned during your talk this university's role in reducing our own carbon emissions, and I'm wondering if you can go into more detail about that, and just also broadly university's role in decarbonizing our way of life and our world.
Yes, the last time I was here, I had a wonderful dinner with Chancellor Reyes, and he was very excited about this 2032 he'd just taken over and was, the no carbon thing was a big thing and whatever. And so I think it'd be a good idea to just keep reminding him of how cool that's going to be. At Middlebury, we're going to be zero carbon by 2028, and I think we're actually on track to meet it and make it happen, because we're building, among other things, lots and lots of solar panels, which is essentially what it takes. Universities are important because of their footprint, but really they're more important because of their mission, which is to educate people. And one way you educate people is, sit them down in class and tell them things. But I must say, after years as a professor, I'm less convinced that model, I'm never all that convinced how much anyone remembers very long after class is over, So it's also very useful to try and educate people all the time by what's going on around them, what they see. It would be great to have a bunch of solar panels in the center of campus here and understand them as beautiful. There's a lake out there. One of the things that we're really getting good at in this world is floating solar panels, and people are putting them all kinds of interesting places now, and that would be a beautiful addition to this campus. It would be even more beautiful than some of the architecture that currently graces this campus. Actually, they're figuring out how to make, how to do lots of places with both wildlife and solar panels, and it'd be a good project to be working on, how to make that compatible.
I think part of the conversation in the university is to also kind of elevate the level of emergency response that we need in terms of educating and preparing a resilient body of students. And I was just thinking, 50% of carbon emissions that is currently up there is actually from the 1990s. It's post-Cold War carbon dioxide emission, a time of neoliberal growth, a time also when universities turned more and more towards narrower and narrower fields of specialization. Yep. Do you think that university education itself needs to be rethought?
I think it's such a good point. The climate change strikes me as the best way to break down some of the siloing that's marked higher education. I mean, we really have proceeded on this model that the right way to proceed is to break everything down into the smallest components so that you can, make progress on it, which, did its thing for a while. Now, the great challenge is to figure out how to synthesize what we do know in order to, the reason that we did that, the reason we broke everything down like that, especially in the hard sciences, and then everybody else just followed merrily after, was because that was what allowed us to come up with the most new ways of inventing stuff and doing stuff. It was the most conducive way to meet the 20th century's key project, which was growing the size of the economy. That's really what mattered, and that's what universities oriented themselves to do. And, it was very nice if there was a little bit of, poetry and, whatever alongside. Now, the human project is about surviving, and perhaps thriving in the course of what we're doing, but figuring out how to live on this planet. And that requires the collaboration of so many disciplines at once. So in truth, the physicists and the chemists are the least of it now. They've actually done their job. They've told us what's happening, given us fair warning, and the engineers have done 70% of their job. They can make solar panels more efficient, but really they've provided us with the tools that we need, okay? But now we need psychologists, sociologists, economists, political scientists, theologians,
Literary
scholars, on and on and on. Yes, and literary, I mean, look, a new metaphor is as important as anything else in getting this work done, and I firmly believe that. I think it's on the back. If we do this Sunday thing, then it's, music and art are going to be absolutely crucial parts of it. But all that only happens if people actually try. And that's why we organize things like these days of action, to give people the excuse to come together and figure out. Because if you're trying to get people to love solar panels, then yes, you need engineers and you need economists and you need political scientists and policy people, but you also need musicians and artists who can help us develop the aesthetic that we need, so that when you look up at a wind turbine, you don't think, that's ugly. You think, there's the breeze made visible, so that when you look at a solar panel, the thing you hear in the back of your head is, George Harrison singing Here Comes the Sun, and those are a different set of associations and images and exactly what we need.
Is this thing on? Good. One thing I've been dying to know, you spent a lot of the time during your speech praising solar panels and stuff like that, and I've seen a lot of praise for it everywhere. The 1 gigawatt per day thing is really remarkable and quite shocking, but there's just one thing I can't quite get over, and I've seen the argument made that solar panels, after their useful lifespan, after that 20 years, I've seen pictures of them just in piles and dumps and not knowing what to do with them. People saying that the semiconductors in them are toxic and all that, have toxic metals in them. What do we do with them after they're expired?
It's a very good question. So the first piece of good news is they're turning out to last much longer than people thought. So they're now been warranted for 40 years, not 20. And that's because that's how long they're lasting. But the second thing is we really have figured out how to recycle them. Almost all the parts of them are recyclable, like the aluminum and stuff. And when people put them up in a field, if you in a state like Massachusetts, if you put up a solar farm, one of the things you have to do is from the beginning pay a bond to that goes for the eventual deconstruction of that solar farm and its recycling, which, by the way, is going to be an enormous problem because the oil and gas industry never really did that they were allowed not to do that. And we have an endless number of orphaned, leaking old oil and gas wells across America, okay? But all the valuable components now we can get at. Go Google. There was just a big piece just yesterday, because I think it's been in operation a year, this big factory, a company called Redwood Materials or Resources or something, that built the first big American recycling plant. It's on the Nevada-California border, and basically it's a low-temperature kiln, and you just drop batteries and old solar panel component stuff in the top, and out the other end come lithium, cobalt, copper. We're getting back like 97% of the stuff that we're putting in. So it'll take some work to force them to do it, but we're beginning to do it, and we definitely should do it now to just make it a feature of this, that we can recycle it. And just to remind ourselves, you can't do that with fossil fuel, because you set it on fire and then it turns into the most dangerous thing on Earth, which is carbon dioxide.
I'm conscious of the time, so I
Maybe-
wonder if we might bunch all the questions together. Would that be okay?
It would be fine. I'm rattling on much too long.
5 minutes left.
Just a quick question about food waste, composting, production of soil, reduction of solid waste.
Yeah, it's a very good idea. We're now doing it fairly assiduously in Vermont. and it's important to work on. One of the problems with energy, with climate change is that energy is so central. It's like 85% of the issue here, that we end up triaging a lot of other important environmental things that we should be paying attention to also. But I got to say, that's why I spend all my time on energy, because it's at the very heart. But thank you for that.
Hi, hi, Professor. Thank you for your talk. Something that I was wondering, you mentioned near the end the importance of both older folks and younger folks in the climate justice movement. I found that, at least in my personal experience, and perhaps this differs for different people, but I found in my personal experience, talking with older people in my life, that there's a pretty big disconnect in terms of just communication between the two movements. And as groups with very different things to offer the movement in terms of experience versus the people who will be living in the the impacts of climate change in a few decades. How would you suggest that the two movements could become closer together, exchange information, align themselves better?
I'll answer it quickly, because I'll forget otherwise, because I'm old. So if you ask me to remember 3 things at once, I can't. It's a very good question. It's why we set up Third Act. Tell the older people in your lives about it, because we're good at communicating to other people of a certain age why this kind of political action is important, and we love cooperating with young people on it. When we started Third Act, in some ways it was because friends of mine in the youth climate movement, one of the things they wanted to do was take on the big banks who were funding all the fossil fuel industry. And I remember this group from Fridays for the Future, kind of Greta's group in this country, saying, we want to go after Citibank, but we don't even have checking accounts or credit cards or anything. Can you help? And so we were like, sure, we can help. And the big first demonstration we did was in Boston, and it was at Downtown Crossing there, outside the Citibank or maybe the Chase Bank or something. And there were, 200 or 300 high school kids, because they know the barrel of the gun down which they are staring, So they were there, and they're Sprier, so they were out at the head of the march. But behind them, there was a big group of us from this nascent Third Act with a banner that said, "Fossils against fossil fuels." And so everybody was like, "All right, we can do this together."
Thanks very much for your talk. I'd love to hear you talk a little more about China. China seemed to play a very big role in what you're describing as perhaps the biggest transformation in a couple thousand years of human history. You've talked about the democratic potential of solar to sort of make energy more anarchic, more available to everyone, the very beautiful vision of people in Pakistan just laying out solar panels on the ground. And yet, China is a deeply authoritarian country, and in the story you're telling, the transformation you'd like to see would not be possible without China. So I'd love to hear you reflect more on that.
I mean, there are definitely contradictions there that I don't completely understand. I do think that China is going to be, my guess is that we're going to watch over the next 10 years as China assumes a very different leadership role in the world than they've played before, partly as the U.S. just cedes this ground, and partly as China takes the moral high ground in the greatest problem that the world faces. And yeah, I mean, it comes with all kinds of contradictions, as contingent history always does. But I do think it's just worth noting that the most important things in the world probably are China's solar panel factories, which are capable of producing about 1.1 terawatts of solar panels a year. At the moment, there's only the demand for about half of that, economic demand, so they're only running at about half capacity. Take a better economist than me, but I think there's a profound argument that a sensible world would, at some level, internationalize those factories, run them 24/7, and drop those solar panels on every wharf and every dock in the planet Earth. Just let people come take them away. It feels to me like that might, I mean, the sort of Pakistani example really moves me, and that might be, in certain ways, the single smartest global policy that we could imagine right now.
Thank you, Bill. And just as a closing note, I wonder, because you've written about it and spoken about it, I wonder if you wouldn't mind just reminding us about the importance of community and sanctuary, and especially so in the Pioneer Valley.
Absolutely. I mean, look, the American, our particular American sin is a kind of hyper-individualism that I think kind of took root under Reagan in the most profound ways, and so on. There's ways in which this kind of renewable energy world can play into that, like you put your solar panels on your roof and you've got your battery in your basement and you don't depend on anyone for anything anymore. And truthfully, that's one of the reasons why there's real possibilities for kind of bipartisan across ideological work. But I think the more beautiful vision is just that this is a way to start building down the scale at which we're doing things. The Pioneer Valley, I bet, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I have no doubt sends hundreds of millions of dollars a year to Saudi Arabia and Texas and other places in order to acquire the hydrocarbons that it uses. Hundreds of millions of dollars that could stay right here, producing the energy that's needed close to home, and then doing all kinds of other things too once you've done that. We got good, and UMass was one of the places that sort of pioneered it about thinking about local food in powerful ways. Well, local electrons are at least as necessary, and they have the distinct advantage of being affordable too, This is a great revolution that one of its blessings is that it's inherently a little more small d democratic than the thing that it replaces, and that it moves us in the direction of community because the sun and the wind are everywhere. And that's that realization. And I'll just give you one statistic that really helps it stay in my mind. 40% of all the ship traffic on planet Earth, all the ships moving back and forth, 40% of that just moves coal and gas and oil back and forth across the planet to be burned somewhere else. And we don't have to do that, because the sun is happy to move across the planet every single day, delivering this freight for free. The reason that the fossil fuel industry hates it so much is that it delivers it for free every single day. And if you're Exxon, that's the stupidest business model in history, But for the rest of us, it's the most beautiful business model in history. It's the kind of back to the garden kind of world. And so let us hope, and let us do more than hope. Let us work hard to make it happen.
And on that note, thank you very much. Thank you.